The fine October rain painted the Parisian sidewalks with a silvery varnish that reflected the amber lights of the streetlights. It was one of those nights when the city seemed to hold secrets on every corner, where the smell of fresh bread mingled with the aroma of strong coffee and cheap cigarettes. In the heart of the 6th arrondissement, the Bistrot Le Croissant d'Or shone like a discreet jewel among the Haussmannian buildings, its fogged windows revealing silhouettes of satisfied customers savoring coq au vin and confit de canard prepared according to recipes passed down through generations. Behind the polished mahogany counter, with a smile that seemed too genuine to be true, Rafael Mendez adjusted the burgundy tie of his uniform and greeted each customer as if they were an old friend, his nimble hands organizing reservations in a worn leather notebook while his dark brown eyes scanned every face that crossed the threshold. No one would have imagined that this 25-year-old Brazilian receptionist, with his near-perfect French seasoned with a charming accent, carried on his shoulders a ghostly identity and a past that Interpol was pursuing across 7 continents. 3 tables away, seated strategically with her back to the wall as her father had taught her since childhood, Amélie Dubois observed. At 19, she possessed that understated, typically French beauty that didn't need excessive makeup. Straight brown hair cut to her shoulders, penetrating green eyes inherited from her deceased mother, and an expression of perpetual curiosity that made her seem constantly on the verge of discovering something fascinating. It was the 3rd time that week she had found excuses to dine at Le Croissant d'Or, always asking for table number 7, always arriving at the time Raphael took over the night shift. She dipped her fork into the crème brûlée while pretending to read Camus, but her eyes betrayed her intentions by subtly lifting each time he passed, observing the way his shoulders moved under his impeccable white shirt, how he smiled at the elderly customers with a patience that seemed genuine. There was something about him that intrigued her beyond the obvious attraction, a contradiction between the lightness of his gestures and an almost imperceptible tension he carried in the muscles of his neck, like an animal always on alert. Inspector Henri Dubois finished examining the documents scattered across his desk at the Police Nationale headquarters and rubbed his tired eyes with the back of his hands. At 52, 30 of those years dedicated to uncovering the darkest corners of French crime, his angular face, marked by deep wrinkles, was a map of sleepless nights and cases that gnawed at his soul. His perfectly combed gray hair was his last concession to vanity, a habit that Marie, his late wife, had always appreciated. On the table, photographs of crime scenes mingled with Europol reports on a recent wave of cyber attacks threatening banking systems in at least 15 countries. Operations too sophisticated to be the work of amateur hackers, with digital traces that vanished like smoke at the slightest sign of investigation. Henri sighed deeply, realizing it was past 10 o'clock at night. Amélie would certainly be worried. Once again he would break his promise to have dinner at home. Once again his daughter would eat alone while he chased ghosts on computer screens and confidential files. Raphael had noticed Amélie the very first night she appeared at the bistro. It was impossible not to notice. She possessed that aura of someone belonging to a different world, polite but not arrogant, curious but not intrusive. He had learned to read people like one reads programming code, identifying patterns of behavior and vulnerabilities with surgical precision, a skill honed over years operating in the shadows of the deep web, where a misjudgment meant prison or worse. But with Amélie it was different. When she entered for the 3rd time and their eyes met for 3 seconds longer than the protocol of courtesy required, something inside him trembled like a structure about to collapse. He approached table 7 with the reservation book in hand, a flimsy excuse to start a conversation. "Mademoiselle, forgive the intrusion, but I notice you appreciate Camus," he said in near-perfect French, discreetly pointing to the copy of L'Étranger on the table. "It's one of my favorites, although I confess that the absurdity of existence makes more sense when read in Portuguese, my mother tongue. Something is lost in translation, but melancholy is gained." Amélie looked up from the book, and Raphael noticed that she held the fork with a precision that was not accidental, her thumb positioned defensively, another detail learned undoubtedly from someone trained for confrontational situations. "You're Brazilian," Amélie replied, and it wasn't a question. "I imagine Paris is quite different from where you come from." There was genuine curiosity in her voice, but also that characteristic caution of someone who grew up learning that not all people are what they seem. Raphael smiled, a smile he had calibrated over the years to convey openness without revealing anything. "From São Paulo. And yes, it's different. There the chaos is visible, honest. Here, The chaos hides beneath layers of elegance and tradition, which in a way makes it more dangerous. He wasn't sure why he said that. It was too sincere, a breach of protocol. But bistros make me feel at home, he added quickly. There's something universal in the way people gather around good food and honest conversations. Amélie tilted her head slightly, studying him. My father always says that the best conversations happen when people aren't trying to impress. How long have you worked here? Raphael felt an alarm go off in his mind upon hearing the word father, combined with that specific tone of respect and reference. 6 months, she replied. A mixture of truth and omission, the safest combination. And you? Are you a student? Amélie nodded. Sorbonne, French literature and philosophy. Cliché, I know, but someone needs to keep the traditions alive, right? They laughed together, and in that moment Raphael forgot for a few seconds who he really was. In the following weeks, those casual encounters turned into a ritual. Amélie would show up at Le Croissant d'Or 3, then 4 times a week, always bringing a different book, always asking for table 7. Raphael found increasingly creative excuses to approach her. A wine recommendation that would perfectly complement the dish of the day, a comment about the author she was reading, a question about university that served as a pretext for longer conversations. On one of those nights, when the restaurant was almost empty, and Chef Jacques was starting to turn off the stoves in the kitchen, Raphael finally asked if she would like to walk along the banks of the Seine after he finished his shift. Amélie accepted without hesitation, and as they walked under the illuminated bridges with the Eiffel Tower twinkling in the distance like a beacon through mist and memory, she told him about her mother, whom she had lost to cancer when she was only 12 years old, about her father who had become simultaneously overprotective and distant, immersed in his work as a way of avoiding confronting his grief. Raphael listened in respectful silence, and when she finally asked about his family, he improvised a carefully constructed story. His parents had died in a car accident when he was 20. He had no siblings, and he had come to Paris seeking a fresh start in a city where no one knew him. The lie flowed too smoothly, polished by repetition in previous lives under other names, but there was a truth embedded in it. He really was alone. When you're wanted by Interpol for coordinating an international cybercrime network that diverted over $400 million from banking and corporate systems through sophisticated phishing, compromising business emails, and laundering money via cryptocurrencies, you don't keep close friends or family members you can visit. Rafael Mendez wasn't even his real name. He was Vitor Almeida when he hacked his first bank at 17 in a Copacabana internet cafe. He was Marcus Silva when he led the operation that paralyzed the financial systems of 2 South American countries simultaneously at 22. At 25, after burning so many identities that he no longer remembered which one was the original, he became Rafael Mendez, a bistro receptionist in Paris, invisible in the crowd of Brazilian immigrants that the city absorbed with bureaucratic indifference. The forged documents were flawless, the work of a Serbian forger who charged in Bitcoin and never asked questions. The tiny apartment in Belleville was rented in the name of a shell company registered in Malta. Every detail had been calculated to construct a life so mediocre and uninteresting that no authority would waste resources investigating it. But Amélie was ruining all the plans. For the first time in 8 years operating in the shadows of digital crime, Raphael felt something beyond adrenaline and paranoia. He felt that dangerous and stupid thing that normal people call hope. He began to imagine impossible scenarios where he could truly be Rafael Mendez, where his past was exactly the story he had told, where he could wake up next to her without the weight of secrets that would kill any possibility of a future together. This terrified him more than any international arrest warrant. With each encounter, he found himself blurring the line between the persona and the person a little more, allowing fragments of sincerity to contaminate his carefully structured lies. He told her about his passion for chess, true. About how he loved cooking feijoada on Sundays while listening to samba, true. About his fear of growing old alone in a foreign city where no one would miss him, a truth dangerously close to confession. Henri Dubois noticed the change in his daughter before she even said anything. Amélie began to smile more, distracted during their Saturday morning breakfasts, checking her phone with unusual frequency, choosing clothes with extra care. When she finally mentioned she was dating someone, a Brazilian man who worked as a receptionist at a bistro in the 6th arrondissement, Henri felt that protective paternal instinct ignite like an alarm. But he also saw in his daughter's eyes something he hadn't seen since before Marie's death, genuine joy, that lightness of someone discovering possibilities instead of dwelling on losses. So he swallowed his instinctive objections, his questions about background and intentions, and simply said, "I'd like to meet him. Why don't you invite him for dinner next Sunday?" Amélie hugged her father so tightly that Henri felt his heart clench, remembering when she was little and hugged him like that after nightmares, trusting that he could protect her from all the monsters in the world. But Henri knew, after 3 decades chasing criminals, that the most dangerous monsters are those who seem perfectly normal, who smile and say the right things while weaving invisible webs around their victims. When Amélie called to invite him, Raphael felt the icy panic of the trap closing in. Dinner with a national police inspector, however presented as a simple family gathering, was precisely the kind of exposure he had spent years avoiding. His first reaction was to fabricate an excuse, perhaps even disappear completely, burn another identity, and start over in another city where the risks were more manageable. But then he heard the excitement in Amélie's voice, the vulnerability behind the casual invitation, and realized that refusing would be the end of any real possibility between them. Besides, a part of him, the stupid part that was beginning to believe in redemption, thought that perhaps this was precisely what he needed, to confront reality, to test whether his new identity was solid enough to withstand the scrutiny of a trained professional, to prove to himself that he could actually build something legitimate from the ashes of who he used to be. "It will be an honor," he replied, and this time the lie contained so much truth that he could hardly tell the difference. The Dubois' apartment was in Montmartre, in an early 20th century building with a wrought iron elevator that creaked as it ascended its 6 floors. Raphael held the wine he had bought from a cellar recommended by Jacques, the bistro's chef, and took a deep breath before ringing the doorbell. Henri opened the door and the 2 men silently sized each other up for 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. The inspector was exactly as Raphael had imagined. Tall, broad-shouldered even for 52, gray eyes that seemed to catalog every detail in fractions of a second, a handshake firm enough to convey authority without exaggeration. "Raphael, I presume, come in, please. Amélie is finishing preparing dessert." The voice was cordial but neutral, without excessive warmth, but also without obvious hostility. Raphael entered the apartment and immediately began processing information in survival mode, which he automatically activated in high-risk environments. 3 possible exits, including the living room window leading to the fire escape, no visible security cameras, a bookshelf full of books on criminology and French history, a framed photograph of Henri with Amélie as a child, and a woman who was obviously his deceased wife. No sophisticated technical equipment in sight. The dining room was surprisingly cozy, decorated with understated taste that balanced functionality and memory. Amélie emerged from the kitchen, her cheeks flushed from the oven's heat, and embraced Raphael with a naturalness that made Henri subtly narrow his eyes, assessing the physical intimacy between them. Dinner began with the expected tension of first family gatherings, conversations about the weather, polite questions about work at the bistro, comments on the quality of the wine Raphael had brought. But gradually, as Henri served the boeuf bourguignon he had spent the afternoon preparing following Marie's recipe, the atmosphere began to relax. Raphael demonstrated genuine knowledge of French cuisine, spoke respectfully about the traditions of Parisian bistros, and the importance of preserving authenticity amidst the gastronomic gentrification transforming the city. Henri, to his own surprise, found himself genuinely fond of the young man. There was something about him, a maturity that seemed disproportionately greater than his stated 25 years, but also a careful attention to Amélie that seemed too genuine to be manipulation. "So, Raphael, Amélie told me you came to Paris seeking a fresh start after the death of your parents," Henri said as he poured more wine, his voice still casual, but with that specific tone that indicated the real interrogation was beginning. "That must have required considerable courage. Paris is not an easy city for immigrants, especially without a family support network." Raphael nodded, knowing that every word would be weighed and evaluated. It was difficult at first. The language, the bureaucracy, the constant feeling of not belonging. But I discovered that sometimes solitude is necessary to truly discover who we are, when all external expectations and definitions are removed. He hadn't planned to be so candid, but the words came out anyway. Besides, Paris has this unique ability to absorb people reinventing themselves. I think that's why so many artists and writers throughout the centuries have come here seeking refuge and rebirth. Henri tilted his head, processing. "Rebirth implies previous death. What exactly were you fleeing from or dying from when you came here?" The question was astute, phrased in a way that seemed philosophical, but sought concrete information. Raphael felt a cold sweat beginning to form on the back of his neck. Mainly expectations, Raphael replied after a calculated pause. In Brazil, especially in São Paulo, there's this constant pressure for productivity, financial success, climbing the corporate ladder. When my parents died, I realized I was chasing the version of success they wanted for me, not the one I truly desired. So I sold everything, bought a one-way ticket, and decided it would be more honest to work as a receptionist in a bistro doing something that brings me peace than to continue pretending to be someone I'm not. It was a lie interwoven with so many threads of truth that even he almost believed it as he spoke. Amélie discreetly reached for his hand under the table, a gesture of support that made Raphael's heart clench painfully. Henri observed the gesture, and something in his expression softened almost imperceptibly. I admire that, the inspector finally said. It takes more strength to recognize what truly matters than to simply follow the expected path. Marie, my wife, used to say that someone's true character is revealed not in what they achieve, but in what they are willing to give up. The rest of the dinner went more smoothly, and when Raphael left 3 hours later, Henri shook his hand with genuine warmth and said, I hope to see you again soon. In the following weeks, Raphael became a regular presence at the Montmartre apartment. Sunday dinners became a tradition, often expanding to include aunts, distant cousins, and Henri's colleagues who would stop by for coffee and end up staying for conversations that stretched late into the night. Raphael discovered he possessed a natural talent for this type of socializing, managing to balance charm and discretion, offering opinions when asked but never dominating conversations, remembering everyone's names and personal details with impressive precision. Henri began to see him not just as Amélie's boyfriend, but as part of the family, the kind of presence that fills voids you didn't even know existed until they were occupied. One afternoon, while they were watching a football match together with Henri passionately explaining the tactical nuances of PSG, the inspector put his hand on Raphael's shoulder and said, You know, after Marie died, I worried that Amélie and I would be trapped in grief, two lonely people sharing the same space but unable to truly connect. But you brought life back into this house, and for that, I am grateful. Raphael felt the guilt like a sharp blade piercing his chest. Every moment of acceptance, every genuine smile from Henri, every hug from Amélie, made the weight of his lies more unbearable. He began to seriously question whether he could truly leave the past buried, whether the identity of Rafael Mendez could eventually erase Vitor Almeida and Marcos Silva completely. He discreetly began to research possibilities. Were there ways to negotiate immunity with authorities in exchange for information about larger criminal networks? Could he disappear so completely that not even Interpol could track him, leading Amélie to start over in some country without extradition treaties? All options seemed impossible or too morally compromised to be viable. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He began to consider honesty. Perhaps if he confessed everything to Amélie, if he voluntarily surrendered to the authorities, if he fully cooperated, there might be some chance of eventually rebuilding something real after paying for his crimes. It was delusional thinking, he knew, born more of despair than logic, but the alternative, continuing to live a lie that grew more complex each day, seemed equally unsustainable. The decision was taken from his hands on a rainy Tuesday in November. Henri was at his desk at the Police Nationale headquarters when he received a priority alert from Interpol via encrypted channel. A new coordinated operation against cybercrime, codenamed Heike 7th, was being launched with a specific focus on sleeper cells in Western Europe. The attached dossier contained updated profiles of 17 high-priority targets, hackers who had disappeared after significant operations and were believed to be living under false identities in large cities where they could easily blend in. Henri began reviewing the files with the professional attention of 3 decades, analyzing patterns of behavior, modus operandi, old photographs of suspects captured by security cameras in airports and internet cafes before they disappeared. When he reached profile number 12, his blood ran cold. The photograph was from 6 years ago, taken in São Paulo, showing a young man of approximately 19 years old, leaving a commercial building, shorter hair, no beard, glasses that were probably a disposable accessory, but his eyes were unmistakable, as was the thin scar above his left eyebrow that Raphael explained was the result of a bicycle accident in his childhood. The dossier identified the man in the photograph as Vitor Almeida, also known as Marcus Silva, also known by at least 7 other aliases, wanted for coordinating operations that diverted over $450 million through sophisticated phishing, compromise of corporate emails, investment fraud, and money laundering via cryptocurrency exchanges based in jurisdictions without legal cooperation. The listed charges were extensive enough to result in decades of imprisonment in multiple jurisdictions. Even more worrying, the dossier indicated that Almeida Silva possessed access to critical backdoors in financial systems in at least 20 countries, representing a national security threat should he decide to reactivate them or sell them to more dangerous groups. Henri read the document 3 times, each reading hammering the impossibility of the situation deeper into his chest. The man who dined at his house, who made his daughter laugh for the first time since Marie's death, whom he had begun to see as a potential son-in-law, was one of Europe's most wanted cybercriminals. And Henri, a senior inspector with the Police Nationale, had a legal and moral obligation to arrest him immediately. But there was Amélie to consider. Henri knew his daughter well enough to know that discovering the man she was in love with was an international criminal would destroy her in a way she might never fully recover from. She had already lost her mother too soon, already carried emotional scars that manifested in occasional nightmares and difficulty deeply trusting new people. This would break her differently, more deeply, because it would be a chosen betrayal rather than an inevitable illness. Henri closed the dossier and rested his forehead in his hands. 30 years of certainties about right and wrong, law and justice, duty and family, all colliding in his mind like tectonic plates generating an earthquake. He had 48 hours before he needed to report any relevant information to the coordinators of Operation Hichi 7th. 48 hours to decide between being the inspector who had sworn to protect society or the father who had sworn to protect his daughter, knowing that either choice would result in irreparable betrayal of one of the oaths. That night, Henri arrived home later than usual and found Amélie and Raphael in the living room watching an old French film, she leaning on his shoulder with that casual intimacy of someone who no longer needs to feign formality. Raphael stood politely when Henri entered, always respectful, always attentive to social nuances. "Inspector, good evening. May I make some coffee?" Henri forced a smile and shook his head. "Thank you, Raphael, but I need to talk to you. Alone, if possible." Amélie frowned, immediately sensing the tension in her father's voice. "Dad, did something happen?" Henri kissed the top of his daughter's head. "It's about work, darling. Just some routine questions. Don't worry." But Amélie knew her father too well to believe the forced tranquility. Raphael followed Henri to the office, his brain already firing in survival mode, calculating escape routes, assessing whether the forged documents would withstand a thorough investigation, considering how long it would take to disappear completely if necessary. Henri closed the office door and gestured for Raphael to sit down. They remained silent for long seconds, the inspector studying the young man's face, searching for signs of guilt or fear. Raphael maintained a neutral expression, years of training operating under pressure allowing him to control micro-expressions that could betray him. Finally, Henri opened the desk drawer and placed the Interpol dossier on the table between them, open to the page with the photograph of São Paulo and the detailed profile of Vitor Almeida. "I'd like you to explain this to me," Henri said, his voice low but laden with contained emotion that oscillated between anger, disappointment, and something close to a plea for a reasonable explanation. Raphael looked at the dossier and felt all the blood drain from his face. For a moment he considered continuing to deny it, fabricating a story about a look-alike or mistaken identity, but he saw in Henri's eyes that any further lie would be the final insult that would destroy any possibility of a minimally humane resolution to the situation. "It's all true," Raphael finally said, his voice hoarser than he intended. "Every accusation in this dossier. Vitor Almeida was my real name. Marcus Silva was the identity I used for 3 years. Rafael Mendez is who I tried to become when I realized I couldn't live that way anymore." He took a deep breath, trying to organize thoughts that seemed to fragment under the weight of the confession. "I started hacking banks when I was 17, more out of arrogance and curiosity than out of a real need for money. I discovered I was exceptionally good at it, that I could see patterns and vulnerabilities in systems that others didn't even realize existed. And there was this feeling of power, of being smarter than all the protections that corporations spent millions developing. It escalated gradually, first small amounts that no one would notice, then more complex operations involving international networks, then coordinating teams in multiple countries, carrying out simultaneous attacks that paralyzed entire systems. Henry listened impassively. His face transformed into the professional mask he wore during interrogations, but Raphael could see his hands trembling slightly on the table. At 23, I had more money than I could spend in several lifetimes, all hidden in offshore accounts and untraceable cryptocurrency wallets. But I also had this constant paranoia, waking up in the middle of the night checking if there were police officers at the door, avoiding cameras, changing my identity every 6 months, without real friends or genuine human connections because everything was an operational risk. I realized I had built a prison around myself that was far more efficient than anything the authorities could do. Raphael paused, trying to find words to explain the inexplicable. So I decided to stop. Simply stop. I destroyed all backups, deleted contacts, anonymously transferred a large portion of the stolen money to charities through channels that couldn't be traced back to me, keeping only enough to establish a new identity and start over legitimately. Rafael Mendez was a genuine attempt to be a normal person. I worked hard at the bistro, paid taxes, lived humbly, tried to build an honest life within the limits of starting with a false identity. And then I met Amélie. For the first time since he began speaking, Raphael's voice broke slightly, and for the first time in 8 years, I felt that maybe I could really be someone different, that the past could be buried, and I could genuinely build a future that was worthwhile. I know this sounds like the pathetic rationalization of a criminal trying to justify unjustifiable actions, but it's true. Every moment with her, every dinner in this house with you and your family, made me want to be the person I intended to be, not what I was. Henri remained silent for what seemed like an eternity. When he finally spoke, his voice was weary beyond mere physical exhaustion. Do you understand the impossible position you've put me in? I'm a senior inspector with the Police Nationale. I have a legal obligation to arrest you immediately and hand you over to Interpol. But you've also become someone my daughter loves, someone I've come to see as part of this family. How can I do both? How can I protect my daughter and fulfill my oath at the same time? Raphael nodded slowly, perfectly understanding the dilemma. You can't. Any choice you make will result in loss. If you arrest me, Amélie will never forgive you for destroying her happiness, even if it's the legally correct thing to do. If you let me go, you'll be betraying everything you believe in professionally and becoming complicit in my crimes through omission. He met Henri's eyes directly. Then let me make the decision for you. I'll disappear tonight. Amélie will wake up tomorrow and I simply won't be here anymore. You can tell her you discovered my true identity and that I escaped before being arrested. She'll suffer, but eventually she'll understand that you were just doing your job. And as for me, I'll keep running until I'm eventually captured or manage to disappear permanently somewhere. Even Interpol can't reach me. Henri narrowed his eyes, processing the proposal. There was a dark elegance to it. It allowed him to maintain professional integrity, while sparing Amélie the traumatic arrest of her boyfriend by her own father. But it also meant allowing a dangerous criminal to escape, potentially putting more people at risk if he decided to resume his previous activities. Or, Henri said slowly, each word carefully weighed, you could cooperate fully, turn yourself in voluntarily, provide all the information you possess about other criminal networks, testify in trials, help authorities prevent future attacks using your technical knowledge. In exchange, you could negotiate a reduced sentence, perhaps even some form of rehabilitation and reintegration. Raphael laughed humorlessly. Inspector, with all due respect, people with my level of involvement in international cybercrime don't get reduced sentences. At best, I'd spend the next 3 decades in federal prison divided among multiple jurisdictions, each wanting its piece of justice. At worst, I'd be murdered in my cell by criminal organizations worried about what I might reveal. There's no scenario where this ends with me having any kind of future with Amélie. A heavy silence fell over the office, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall marking the seconds that were slipping away from the 48 hours Henri had before he needed to report information. The office door burst open. Amélie stood in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes red, indicating she had been crying. I heard everything, she said, her voice trembling but determined. The house is old, the walls are thin, and you weren't exactly whispering. She looked at Raphael with an expression that mixed pain, confusion, and something that could be anger, or perhaps just deep disappointment. So it was all a lie? Your parents? Your history? Who you are? Everything? Raphael stood up, instinctively wanting to approach her, but Amélie recoiled. Not everything, he said, desperate for her to understand. My feelings for you, what we built together, that was real. The only real thing in years of pretense. Amelie shook her head, tears finally overflowing. How can I believe anything you say when I've discovered your entire existence is a fabrication? How do I know I wasn't just a convenient target? The daughter of an inspector who could provide perfect cover if needed. Because if you were just a cover, I would have disappeared the moment Henri first invited me to dinner here, Raphael replied with an intensity that made Amelie pause. Every moment I spent with you and your family exponentially increased my risk of exposure. Operationally, it was insanity to stay, but I stayed because for the first time in my entire adult life, I felt I could be someone other than a criminal and a fugitive. You made me want to be better, and I know that sounds like a pathetic cliché from a bad movie, but it's true. He took a deep breath, knowing he was about to destroy any final possibility of a future together, but also knowing she deserved complete honesty. But you're right not to trust me. I've built a life based on lies, and even my genuine feelings don't erase the damage I've caused thousands of people through my crimes. I don't deserve your forgiveness or your trust, and I certainly don't deserve any future with you. Henri watched the scene unfold with a broken heart, simultaneously seeing his daughter suffer and recognizing in Raphael's remorse something that seemed too genuine to be manipulation. 30 years of experience reading criminals told him that Raphael was being sincere, which in a way made everything even more tragic. Amélie, Henri said gently, we need to decide how to proceed. I have 48 hours before I'm obliged to report this. We can call colleagues now and Raphael will be arrested immediately, or we can give him time to disappear and treat this as if he fled when I discovered his identity. Either way, it's unlikely that you two have a future together. Amélie wiped away her tears with the back of her hand, and Raphael recognized in her the same strength that had allowed Henri to survive decades chasing criminals. There is a third option, she said slowly. Raphael surrenders, cooperates fully as you suggested, provides all the information he has. In return, we, all of us as a family, support him throughout the legal process, hire the best possible lawyer, and testify about the transformation we have seen in him. Amélie, no, Raphael interrupted. You can't associate your name and reputation with this. Your academic career, your social relationships, everything would be tarnished by any connection to me. Not to mention the embarrassment it would cause your father professionally if it were discovered that he harbored a wanted criminal in his home. Amélie looked at her father, then at Raphael, and for the first time since entering the office, a spark of the fire that Henri recognized from Marie appeared in her eyes. You two are so focused on protecting me that you forget I have agency in this decision. Yes, I'm hurt and confused, and part of me never wants to see you again, Raphael. But I also saw who you were during these months. I saw genuine effort to be a better person, and I believe, perhaps stupidly, that people can change if given the chance and structure to do so. She turned to Henri. Dad, you always taught me that justice isn't about revenge. It's about rehabilitation and protecting society. If Raphael cooperates, how many future criminal operations could be prevented with the information he has? How many people would be protected? Henri rubbed his face with his hands, feeling the weight of decades of a career committed to law and order, colliding with a father's love and, surprisingly, a reluctant respect for the man his daughter loved. It would be complicated beyond measure, he said finally. I would have to coordinate with Interpol, Europol, Brazilian authorities, negotiate terms of cooperation before a formal arrest to ensure Raphael receives some legal protection in exchange for testimony. Even then, there are no guarantees. He will still face years in prison at best. Henri looked directly at Raphael, and it would need to be total, absolute cooperation. Every contact, every operation, every backdoor you installed in systems, nothing withheld, no matter how incriminating. Are you willing to do that? Raphael felt something inside him breaking and reconfiguring itself simultaneously. For the first time since beginning his criminal career at 17, he saw a possible path that didn't end in perpetual escape or violent imprisonment, even if that path still involved years lost behind bars. Yes, Raphael replied, his voice firm for the first time since the conversation had begun. I'll tell you everything. I'll provide all the documentation, all the access, all the knowledge I have. Not because I'm negotiating for a lesser sentence, but because it's the only thing I can do now that has any real moral value. If my information can prevent others from causing the harm I caused, then at least some of the evil I put into the world will be compensated. Amélie closed her eyes briefly, and Raphael couldn't tell if it was relief or resignation he saw on her face when she opened them again. Henry nodded slowly, already mentally organizing the complex logistical steps that would follow. "So here's what we'll do," the inspector said, slipping into a professional mode that allowed him to process impossible situations without being paralyzed by emotion. "Raphael will remain here tonight. Tomorrow morning we will contact the Interpol office in Paris through official channels, requesting an urgent meeting under the pretext of sensitive information related to Operation Haichi 7. We will introduce you, along with a lawyer already present, to negotiate terms of cooperation before any formal custody." Over the next 12 hours, the Montmartre apartment became an unlikely operational headquarters that balanced law, morality, and love in ways none of the three occupants had imagined possible days before. Henry spent the early hours in his office, drafting carefully worded memos and making discreet contacts with prosecutors he trusted, building a legal framework that would allow Raphael's cooperation without immediately triggering an arrest that would make negotiation impossible. Raphael, sitting in the living room with the laptop Henri reluctantly allowed under strict supervision, began compiling documentation of years of criminal activity, dates, amounts, bank accounts, cryptocurrency exchanges, contacts in international networks, specific vulnerabilities he had exploited in banking and corporate systems. It was a comprehensive confession that practically guaranteed decades in prison, but he typed with methodical determination, knowing that each piece of information revealed was a small step toward some form of redemption, however incomplete. Amélie alternated between watching Raphael work and sitting silently on the sofa, processing the impossible twists and turns that the last few hours had brought, occasionally allowing herself to cry silently, other times letting anger and betrayal simmer near the surface before being brought under control again by a more complex understanding of the situation. When the sun finally began to illuminate the Paris sky with pink and golden hues, Henri emerged from the office looking as if he had aged 5 years in one night. "It's done," he announced, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "I have an appointment at 10 o'clock with a senior Interpol representative and a prosecutor from the Paris prosecutor's office, whom I've known and trusted for 15 years. I also contacted Marcel Beaumont, one of the best criminal defense lawyers in Paris. He agrees to represent us. He knows the intricacies of complex international cases." Raphael stood up, his body aching from hours sitting in the same position, his eyes burning with fatigue. "Thank you, Inspector. I know this goes against everything you believe in professionally." Henri shook his head slowly. "It doesn't go against what I believe. Justice without the possibility of redemption is merely systematic revenge. But don't be fooled, Raphael. This won't be easy. There are prosecutors who will push for the maximum sentence, countries that will demand your extradition, criminal organizations that will see you as a potential traitor. I'm offering a path through the storm, not a guarantee of clear skies on the other side." At 9:30 a.m., 3 exhausted and emotionally devastated people got into a taxi in Montmartre. Raphael wore the same clothes from the previous dinner, now crumpled, carrying only a backpack with his laptop containing evidence from years of cybercrimes. Amélie sat next to him in the back seat, maintaining a physical distance of a few centimeters that seemed like kilometers, but occasionally their fingers brushed against each other in a way that could be accidental, or could be the last vestige of connection that neither of them was ready to completely abandon. Henri in the front seat obsessively checked messages on his cell phone, confirming final details with the contacts he had made during the early morning. The taxi navigated the Parisian streets towards the Interpol office located in an unassuming building near the Champs-Élysées, its modern architecture contrasting with the surrounding historical buildings, a symbol of how new criminality demanded new enforcement structures. In the fourth-floor meeting room decorated with the functional austerity of international institutions, 3 people awaited: Chief Inspector Michael Russo of Interpol, a woman in her 50s with an expression that suggested she had seen every possible variety of criminal behavior, and was not easily impressed by any of it; Prosecutor Isabelle Moreau, a longtime colleague of Henri's, known for a pragmatic approach that balanced legal rigor with humanitarian considerations; and lawyer Marcel Beaumont, a man in his 60s with a reputation for defending impossible cases and occasionally winning through a combination of impeccable technical knowledge and compelling narratives about mitigating circumstances. The introductions were formal, charged with the tension of a situation where every word would potentially be used in future trials. Raphael shook hands with everyone, noting how Martine held her hand for an additional second, assessing the firmness and perspiration of their palms, reading physical signs of nervousness or confidence. Mr. Mendez, or should I say, Mr. Almeida, Martine began, her voice neutral but sharp. Inspector Dubois indicates that you wish to cooperate voluntarily with our investigations into international cybercrime networks. Before we proceed, I need to clarify that everything said in this room can and will be used in subsequent legal proceedings. Do you understand this? Raphael nodded. I understand perfectly, Chief Inspector. And yes, my real name is Vitor Almeida. Rafael Mendez is the identity I assumed approximately 18 months ago when I settled in Paris. Marcel quickly interjected. My client is prepared to provide full and unrestricted cooperation, including comprehensive details about past operations, network structures, exploited technical vulnerabilities, and information about other criminal actors. In return, we request formal consideration of mitigating circumstances, including voluntary cessation of criminal activity, a genuine attempt at rehabilitation, and the substantial value of the intelligence provided in preventing future crimes. Isabel leafed through documents in front of her, preparatory notes on the case. The accusations against Mr. Almeida are extensive and serious. We are talking about $450 million in funds diverted through multiple internationally coordinated operations, compromise of critical financial infrastructure systems, possible continuous access to backdoors in banks and corporations in at least 20 countries. Even with full cooperation, we would be discussing sentences of decades, not years. What exactly are you proposing? Raphael leaned forward, hands clasped on the table, adopting a posture of total transparency. The proposal is simple, prosecutor. I provide everything. Every operation I have coordinated or participated in since I was 17. Names, dates, amounts, technical methodologies. More importantly, I provide access to and documentation of all the vulnerabilities I exploited, allowing them to be corrected before others discover and exploit them. I also provide information on larger and more dangerous criminal networks than mine, groups that operate on a scale that makes my crimes seem amateurish. Martine narrowed her eyes, her interest clearly piqued. What kind of groups? Raphael took a deep breath, knowing he was about to cross a line of no return. I know of at least 3 state-sponsored organizations operating through criminal proxies to carry out cyber attacks against critical infrastructure in Western countries. I know about a planned massive operation targeting the electrical power systems of 5 European countries simultaneously, scheduled to be executed over the next 8 months. I have communications and technical documentation proving direct links between these organizations and certain governments that officially deny any involvement. The silence that followed was tense, broken only by the sound of Isabel typing rapidly in her notepad. Martine exchanged a meaningful glance with Henri, recognizing that if the information was legitimate, they were dealing with potentially critical national security intelligence, not just a common criminal case. You understand, Martine said slowly, that making such claims about state-sponsored operations requires substantial proof. If you are fabricating or exaggerating to improve your negotiating position, this will destroy any credibility and eliminate any possibility of a deal. Raphael turned to Marcel, who nodded in permission. I brought preliminary evidence, Raphael said, opening his laptop and rotating the screen so everyone could see. These are encrypted logs of communications between coordinators of a network that identifies itself as the Typhon Group. They date from the last 3 years. Note the linguistic patterns, specific cultural references, and consistent time zones of the communications that triangulate precise geographic origin. Here, he pointed to a specific sequence of messages. Explicit discussion about a German electrical infrastructure target with a specific timeline. And here, another set of files. Transfers of funds through decentralized exchanges traceable to wallets controlled by entities linked to specific intelligence agencies. The next 4 hours were an intense technical immersion, as Raphael navigated through files, explaining complex methodologies in language that authorities without deep cybersecurity expertise could understand. Marcel occasionally interrupted to ensure that the terms of Raphael's cooperation were being properly documented, building a legal framework that would protect his client from simply being used as an intelligence source and then discarded with maximum sentence. Isabel and Martine asked penetrating questions, testing the consistency of Raphael's narratives, looking for contradictions or signs of fabrication. Henri watched in silence, impressed and disturbed by the depth of Raphael's involvement in global criminal infrastructure. Amélie, seated in a chair against the wall away from the main table, watched the man she had fallen in love with reveal layers of secret life she had never imagined, feeling simultaneous admiration for his technical intelligence and horror at the damage that intelligence had caused. When they finally took a lunch break, everyone was mentally and emotionally exhausted. Martine and Isabelle left the room to confer privately, leaving Henri, Raphael, Amélie, and Marcel in uncomfortable silence. "It's going better than I expected," Marcel said eventually, his voice low. "Information about the Typhon Group has changed the political calculations of this. If it's verifiable, you're not just a cooperating criminal, you're an intelligence asset. That dramatically changes your negotiating position." Raphael didn't answer, simply staring at his hands. Amélie finally broke her silence, the first time she had spoken since they entered the building. "How did you live with it, knowing the damage you were causing the people affected?" Raphael looked up to meet her eyes. "Rationalization. I told myself I was just transferring digits on screens, that nobody was really getting hurt, that banks and corporations had insurance anyway. I created psychological distance between my actions and their consequences. It's standard defense mechanism for any criminal who isn't a complete psychopath. But eventually that distance disappeared," Amélie pressed, needing to understand. "What changed?" Raphael considered the question carefully. "Several things gradually. I started seeing news about people who lost their entire life savings in bank collapses, partly caused by attacks I participated in. I realized my rationalization about insurance was false, that real damage was occurring, that real people were suffering. And then there was a specific operation I coordinated involving a hospital in Mumbai. The objective was to access the hospital's financial systems, but malware we inadvertently deployed affected medical record systems. Patients didn't receive the correct medications because their records were compromised. 3 people died from direct complications. When I read about it, something inside me broke irreparably. I realized I wasn't just moving digits on screens, I was killing people through technical negligence." Tears began to stream down Raphael's face, the first time Amélie had seen him cry. "So I stopped. I simply stopped everything, but the damage was already done, and no amount of trying to be a better person could bring those 3 people back or undo the suffering I caused thousands of others." Amélie felt something shift within her. It wasn't exactly forgiveness, but a more complex understanding of the person before her, someone who had committed terrible acts, but retained the capacity to recognize and feel their moral weight. "This doesn't absolve you," she said softly, "but perhaps it's the beginning of something akin to redemption." Before Raphael could respond, Martine and Isabelle returned, their expressions indicating they had reached a decision. "Mr. Almeida," Martine began, resuming her seat at the table, "we consulted with superiors and technical experts who conducted a preliminary analysis of the files you provided. Information about the Typhon Group is considered critical enough to warrant a formal cooperation agreement. Here are the terms we can offer. You will provide a full debriefing on all criminal activities, likely lasting several weeks. You will submit to protective custody during this period for your own safety, given that revealing information about dangerous organizations makes you a potential target. After the debriefing is complete, you will be formally charged, but we recommend a reduced sentence of 8 to 12 years depending on the quality and value of the intelligence provided, instead of the 3 decades you would normally face. Furthermore," Isabelle added, "after serving 2/3 of your sentence with good behavior, you would be eligible for a witness protection program with a new identity and relocation to a 3rd country where you could rebuild your life under supervision for an additional 5 years. Marcel nodded slowly, assessing the terms. "It's a fair proposal given the circumstances. My client accepts." He looked at Raphael. "Unless you have objections?" Raphael looked at Amélie, then at Henri, finally back at Marcel. "How much contact will I be able to have with the outside world during protective custody and then during incarceration?" Martine replied, "During the initial debriefing, contact will be limited and monitored for security reasons. During regular incarceration, you will have standard visitation rights. After entering the witness protection program, contact with your previous life would be strongly discouraged for your own safety." The implication was clear. Accepting the deal essentially meant disappearing from Amélie's life, perhaps forever. Raphael closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, there was a calm resolution in them that hadn't been there before. "I accept the terms. When do we start?" Martine checked her watch. We have a secure facility prepared 20 kilometers from Paris where the debriefing will take place. You will be transported there this afternoon. I suggest using the next few hours to organize personal matters." She paused, her expression softening almost imperceptibly, including necessary farewells. The rest of the meeting was formality: signing documents, security briefing, logistical arrangements. When they finally finished and left the building into the Parisian afternoon sun, the surrealism of the situation hit them all. In less than 24 hours, Raphael had gone from boyfriend integrating into the family to confessed criminal entering protective custody, voluntarily walking towards a prison that would last the next decade of his life. Henri suggested they walk to a nearby cafe for a drink before Raphael had to leave. They sat at an outside table, watching Parisians go about their normal routines, oblivious to the intense drama unfolding between the four of them. "I want you to know," Raphael said eventually, addressing himself mainly to Amélie and Henri, "that these months with you have been the best of my life, not just because of the relationship," he looked at Amélie, "but because for the first time, I was able to see a version of the future that didn't involve perpetual escape and constant paranoia. You showed me what normal life could be, and even if I never really get to live that life, at least now I know it exists." Amélie wiped away tears that were beginning to form. "What happens now? Between us?" Raphael gently took her hand, the first time they had touched since the confession. "You move on. You finish your studies at the Sorbonne, write a brilliant dissertation on Camus or Sartre, meet someone who deserves you, and you don't carry the baggage of international crimes. You visit your father on Sundays and gradually forget about the Brazilian who almost destroyed everything." "It doesn't work that way," Amélie protested. "I can't just forget you." Raphael smiled sadly. "Not immediately, but with time, memories fade. Life goes on. It's better this way." Henri, who had watched the exchange in silence, finally spoke. "Raphael, you have my word that I will ensure you receive fair treatment throughout the process. And if Amélie decides to visit you during your incarceration, I will not interfere, but the decision is hers." Raphael nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Inspector, for everything. I know this has cost you your peace of mind, and possibly your professional reputation. I hope that eventually you can see it as having been worthwhile." Henri considered for a moment. "Justice is more complicated than the penal code. I learned that tonight. So yes, I think it was worth it." At 3 o'clock, a discreet vehicle arrived to transport Raphael to the secure facility. Final embraces were exchanged, inappropriate words spoken, impossible promises almost made before being swallowed by reality. Raphael got into the car, and as he drove away, he looked out the back window to see Amélie being embraced by Henri on the sidewalk, both standing there until the car disappeared completely into the maze of Parisian streets, taking with it the man who had been simultaneously her best hope for the future and her greatest disappointment. 6 years later, Frayne prison on the outskirts of Paris no longer seemed as hostile as in the first few months. Raphael had learned to navigate its hierarchical structure, establishing respect through technical knowledge that helped several prisoners maintain contact with their families through the prison system's limited legal resources. His hands, once nimble on keyboards hacking banking systems, now leafed through philosophy books that Amélie sent regularly, her annotations in the margins creating a silent dialogue across the pages. She came to see him every 3 weeks religiously, transforming the visiting room into a temporary sanctuary, where they could pretend for 2 hours that the world beyond those walls didn't exist. Henri came less frequently, but when he did, he brought updates. Raphael's information about the Typhon Group had resulted in the dismantling of an operation that would have caused a massive blackout affecting millions, validating every word of the cooperation agreement. But redemption has a price that transcends bars and reduced sentences. On a Thursday in March, Raphael was summoned to the warden's office, where Michael Russo awaited with a grave expression he had learned to recognize as a harbinger of bad news. "We intercepted communications indicating that a remaining faction of the Typhon Group has identified your location and is planning to eliminate you," she said bluntly. "We have 48 hours, maybe less, before they try to infiltrate someone here or target you during transfer. We need to move you immediately to a protection program, which means entering a new identity now, not in 2 years when you would reach regular eligibility." Raphael felt the ground crumble beneath him. "Amélie, I need to see her before I disappear." Martine shook her head. "Impossible. Security protocol requires the immediate severing of all ties with your previous life. It's precisely to prevent tracking through personal connections. Raphael clenched his fists, years of prison discipline preventing him from exploding. So that's all? I disappear without explanation, leaving her to wonder if I died or simply gave up on her? Martine sighed, a small concession of humanity piercing her professional mask. We can allow a letter, just one. You write it, I'll deliver it personally, but it can't contain any information about your location or new identity. 2 hours later, under the cold, fluorescent light of the security room, Raphael held pen to white paper and began to write the most difficult farewell of his life. Amélie, when you read this, I will already be somewhere I can't even name, living under a name you'll never know. Not because I chose to abandon you, but because dangerous people I betrayed finally got too close. So this is goodbye. The permanent and absolute kind I imagined avoiding by agreeing to cooperate. I want you to know that each of your visits during these 6 years kept me human, when prison tried to turn me into something less. You were my redemption even when I didn't deserve it. Now I need to ask something impossible. Forget me. Not in the romantic way where you keep nostalgic memories, but genuinely release me from your heart and move on. Live the extraordinary life you always knew you would live. Get married. Have children. Write books that change people's perspectives. And occasionally, when you think of the Brazilian you briefly loved, remember not the crimes or the betrayal, but the genuine moments where I was Rafael Mendes, the best version of myself I managed to build on a foundation of lies. Your father is a remarkable man who sacrificed much to do the right thing even when doing the right thing was painful. Take care. From him, with eternal love that he can no longer express, R. The letter was delivered 4 days later at Amélie's thesis defense ceremony at the Sorbonne. Martine waited discreetly at the back of the auditorium while the young woman, now 25 and possessing a presence that combined Marie's intelligence with Henri's determination, defended a brilliant dissertation on existentialism and moral choice in Sartre. When she finished to enthusiastic applause, Martine approached and extended a white envelope. From Raphael. It's all I can give. Amélie read it right there, tears staining the carefully written words. Henri beside her holding her shoulder as she processed the absolute finality of the loss. There would be no more visits. There would be no reunion after liberation. Only emptiness where there used to be possibility. That night, in the Montmartre apartment that held so many memories of Raphael, Amélie wept for the last time for the man she could no longer reach. Then, with a resolution that surprised even Henri, she declared, "He asked me to live, so that's what I'll do." 3 years had passed. Amélie published her first book, exploring narratives of redemption in French literature, with an enigmatic dedication that read only, "For R, wherever he may be." She met a visiting professor from Switzerland during a conference in Lyon, a kind man named Thomas who made her laugh without carrying the weight of impossible pasts. Henri, promoted to commissioner, finally began to sleep through the night, knowing he had made the right choice even if it was the most difficult one. And somewhere off the coast of New Zealand, a man known to his neighbors as David Chen worked as a cybersecurity consultant for small businesses, a modest life built on the ashes of several previous lives. Occasionally, browsing the internet through carefully anonymized connections, he searched for news from Paris. When he found Amélie Dubois' engagement announcement to Thomas Mercier, a philosophy professor, something inside him simultaneously broke and was freed. She was living, exactly as she had asked. That night, David Chen walked along the deserted beach under the constellations of the southern hemisphere, completely different from the Parisian sky that Rafael Mendes used to observe, and allowed himself to cry for the last time for the man he had been and the woman he had loved. Then he returned to his small house, erased the last traces of his search, and began the next chapter of his existence, one that would be defined not by who he had been, but by the choices he would make from then on.